Okinawa, June 1945. Two Japanese soldiers hid in terror. They clutched their rifles, waiting in the dark. Their commanders swore that surrender meant torture, but outside, they heard no threats. Instead, American Marines invited them to share their dinner. The two privates crawled out, expecting a blow. A Marine from the 1st Marine Division handed them spoons. But as they ate, they saw the guards and rifles watching them. Mercy was real, but it was not absolute. When your enemy offers you life with one hand, while the other still holds a weapon, what is the true cost of that kindness? Is less than. BR is greater than. Tell us where you're listening from and the exact time there. We want to see how far these testimonies travel. If mercy and memory matter to you, subscribe to keep them alive. Okinawa, June 1945. Two Japanese soldiers hid in terror. They clutched their rifles, waiting in the dark. Their commanders swore that surrender meant torture. But outside, they heard no threats. Instead, American Marines invited them to share their dinner. The two privates crawled out, expecting a blow. A Marine from the 1st Marine Division handed them spoons. But as they ate, they saw the guards and rifles watching them. Mercy was real, but it was not absolute. When your enemy offers you life with one hand, while the other still holds a weapon, what is the true cost of that kindness? The air inside the limestone cave was thick and hot, smelling of sweat, dirt, and fear. For 3 days, Private Sato and Corporal Nakamura had huddled in the damp darkness. Their world shrunk to the jagged stone walls around them. Sato, at 19, was a farmer's son, his hands more familiar with the smooth handle of a plow than the cold steel of the Arisaka rifle he held. He pressed his back against the cool rock, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger in his belly. Beside him, Corporal Nakamura, a stern but protective factory hand of 23, kept his gaze fixed on the sliver of blinding white light at the cave's entrance. The battle for Okinawa was over. The thunder of artillery had fallen silent, replaced by a stillness that felt even more dangerous. Every rustle of leaves, every distant shout, sent a fresh wave of panic through them. They were the last of their squad, 2 boys left behind in the final, desperate collapse of the 32nd Army's defenses. Their minds were filled with the words of their officers, hammered into them during months of training. The Americans are not human. They are white devils who will desecrate your corpse. They will pull out your gold teeth and torture you for sport. Capture is a stain upon your family for generations. The leaflets dropped by their own commanders were even more stark. They showed drawings of grotesque American soldiers standing over the mutilated bodies of Japanese prisoners. The message was simple and absolute. To be taken alive was a fate worse than death. It was better to die for the emperor, to become a shattered jewel in service to the nation. So they waited for the end, for the metallic rattle of a grenade rolling into their sanctuary, for the blast that would grant them an honorable death. They clutched the 2 grenades they had saved for this purpose, one for the enemy and one for themselves. But the final attack never came. Instead, something strange happened. Through the oppressive silence, a new sound reached them. It was a rhythmic clanking of metal on metal, a sound they could not place. Then came voices, low and relaxed. They were American voices, but they were not the furious roars of combat. The tone was casual, almost conversational. Sato strained his ears, his heart pounding against his ribs. He heard a burst of sound that was utterly alien and unbelievable in this place of death. It was laughter. Not cruel, not mocking, but deep and genuine. It was the sound of young men at the end of a long day, the sound of boys their own age, relieved to have survived. It made no sense. Demons did not laugh like that. Corporal Nakamura slowly lowered his rifle, confusion clouding his face. He was the senior soldier, the one responsible for Sato's life and his honorable death. His duty was clear: fight until the last, and if capture was unavoidable, use the final grenade. Yet the sounds from outside chipped away at his resolve. The casual clanking, the easy voices, the impossible laughter. It was the sound of a world that was still operating by normal rules, a world where men stopped to eat and rest. It was not the sound of a massacre. He looked at Sato, saw the boy's wide, terrified eyes, and felt the weight of his own indoctrination. Were the stories lies? Was everything they had been told about the enemy, about honor and shame, simply a tool to ensure they threw their lives away? Then a single voice, clear and steady, cut through the air. It came from just outside the cave mouth, from a Marine who had approached without shouting, without the aggression they expected. The man spoke in broken, careful Japanese, words he had clearly memorized from a handbook. Dete koi, shokuji, no yoi ga dekite iru. The words were clumsy, but their meaning was unmistakable. Come on out, dinner's ready. There was a long silence. Sato and Nakamura looked at each other, their faces pale in the gloom. Dinner. The word was absurd. They had not eaten a full meal in weeks, surviving on a handful of hardtack and sips of brackish water. The enemy they were supposed to fight to the death, the monsters from their nightmares, were offering them food. It was a trick. It had to be a trick to lure them out into the open for execution. But the voice had held no malice. The laughter they had heard was not that of executioners. The words hung in the still air, a simple invitation that felt more powerful and more terrifying than any threat. The words escaped Sato as a dry whisper, a question that challenged an entire lifetime of belief. If they are devils, why do they laugh? Corporal Nakamura made the decision. He looked at the last grenade, then at Private Sato's exhausted face, and saw not a soldier ready to die for the Emperor, but a boy who deserved to see another sunrise. He slowly placed the grenade on the dusty floor of the cave. With a quiet gesture, he instructed Sato to do the same. Then, he laid down his rifle. Sato, trembling, followed his lead. The sound of the metal scraping against rock was deafening in the silence. Outside, the Marines must have heard it. A moment later, they saw a shadow move at the cave entrance. One of the Americans, a corporal with tired eyes and a smear of dirt on his cheek, placed his own rifle on the ground. Another Marine did the same. As a final gesture of trust, the corporal took a small rectangular tin from his pack and set it carefully at the edge of the shadows, just beyond the cave's mouth. It was a tin of corned beef hash, a simple offering that felt like a treaty. With nothing left to do but trust, Nakamura put his hands in the air and began to crawl out into the blinding sunlight. Sato followed, his limbs weak from hunger and disuse. They emerged not into a hail of bullets or the jeers of their captors, but into the quiet observation of a handful of weary young men. No one shouted. No one shoved them. Instead, the Marine corporal who had called to them stepped forward and handed each of them a spoon. The official American policy in the Pacific was guided by the rules of the Geneva Convention of 1929, which mandated the humane treatment of all prisoners of war. However, on the brutal island battlefields, far from the eyes of generals and diplomats, that policy was often a distant ideal. The reality of war in the Pacific was savage, driven by racial hatred and a cycle of atrocities. For every unit that followed the rules, there was another where surrender was met with a bayonet. Mercy was a choice, not a guarantee. It depended entirely on the character of the men who held the guns. This made the actions of the Marines from the 1st Marine Division all the more remarkable. They were not naive. They had seen their friends die in some of the war's bloodiest fighting. Yet, they chose decency. They waved the 2 skeletal Japanese soldiers over to a cleared patch of ground and motioned for them to sit. For Sato and Nakamura, this gentle treatment was a profound shock. Their own military doctrine insisted that capture was the ultimate disgrace. Pamphlets distributed to every soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army warned that the Americans were barbarians who took no prisoners. To surrender was to betray your family, your nation, and your emperor. Yet by June 1945, on Okinawa alone, over 7,000 Japanese soldiers had made the same choice Sato and Nakamura just had. The fight to the death creed was beginning to fracture under the immense weight of exhaustion and the quiet, persistent hope for survival. A Marine with a ladle moved down the line, scooping out rations for his comrades, and then for the 2 prisoners. He filled their mess kits with a generous portion of white rice, a staple provided by the Navy that tasted like home. He added canned peaches, their sweetness an almost forgotten luxury. And then, he poured a dark, steaming liquid into their canteens. Sato sniffed it cautiously. It was coffee. He had heard of it, but, as a poor farmer's son, had never tasted it. He took a sip. It was bitter, but sweetened with sugar. The warmth spread through his chest, a simple, comforting sensation that undid him completely. Tears began to stream silently down his face, dripping into the food he was so desperately trying to eat. He was weeping for the relief of being alive, for the unexpected kindness of his enemy, and for the deep, suffocating shame he felt at accepting it. This small act of mercy felt like a betrayal of everything he had been taught to believe. He was ashamed to find the enemy's coffee sweet. As he ate, his gaze drifted past the circle of Marines. He noticed the guard towers positioned on the ridge, the glint of the sun on a sniper's scope. The rifles the Marines had set aside were still close at hand. This kindness was real, but it was fragile. It existed inside a perimeter of barbed wire and armed men. They were being fed, but they were not free. They were prisoners, and the mercy they were shown could be taken away as quickly as it had been given. After the meal, as the sun began to dip below the shattered landscape, a fragile peace settled over the small encampment. The tension that had held Sato and Nakamura rigid began to dissolve in the face of small, ordinary gestures. One of the Marines, the young corporal from Ohio, named Harris, offered them cigarettes. Nakamura accepted with a stiff bow, but Sato hesitated. He looked at the simple white tube and was transported back to the tobacco fields near his village, the broad green leaves shimmering in the summer heat. He remembered the smell of the curing barns and the rough, calloused hands of his father. For a fleeting moment, the man offering him the light was not an enemy soldier, but just another young man of 20, far from home. The smoke he inhaled was not the acrid smoke of battle, but a familiar, comforting scent. He was a farm boy again, if only for a single breath. A short while later, a different Marine approached them with a notepad and a pencil. He asked for their names, pointing to his own chest and saying his own name slowly, John. Nakamura gave their names and ranks, watching as the American carefully wrote down the characters he was shown. For the first time since their capture, they were not just prisoners, not just faceless numbers in a defeated army. They were Sato. They were Nakamura. Their existence was being recorded, acknowledged. This simple act of administration felt like an act of profound recognition. They were human beings again. Then came the music. One of the younger Marines pulled a small metal harmonica from his pocket and began to play a simple, lonesome tune. The sound was alien to Sato and Nakamura, a melody from a world they did not know. It was sad but gentle, and it carried on the evening breeze. The Marine caught Sato watching him and winked, then played a jaunty, upbeat series of notes. Against all his training, against all his shame, Sato felt the corners of his mouth turn up in a smile. This kind of mercy was a fragile thing, a small island of decency in an ocean of brutality. For every story like this one, there were countless others that ended in violence. Many Japanese prisoners of war, especially earlier in the conflict, were beaten or executed on the spot. The Geneva Convention was a distant document, and the rules of war were often rewritten in the heat of battle. The logistical chaos of the island-hopping campaign also took its toll. Even with good intentions, the system was overwhelmed. In crowded POW enclosures on other islands, food was scarce, medicine was rare, and disease spread quickly. Humanity was often a casualty not of malice, but of neglect. The ordeal was just as harrowing for the civilians of Okinawa, who were caught between the two warring armies. Deceived by Japanese propaganda that warned of horrific treatment by the Americans, entire families had chosen suicide over surrender, a tragic testament to the power of fear. The kindness Sato and Nakamura experienced was an exception, a moment where a few good men chose to honor a code of conduct their own superiors sometimes ignored. It was real, but it was not the rule. Weeks later, the brief period of stability came to an end. Sato and Nakamura, along with thousands of other prisoners, were herded onto transport ships bound for sprawling POW camps in Hawaii. It was there, months later, that they heard the news. 2 cities in their homeland had been destroyed by a new kind of bomb, and the emperor had spoken on the radio, announcing Japan's unconditional surrender. The war was over. For the prisoners, this news was met not with joy, but with a complex mix of relief and profound dread. They had survived, but what would they return to? Years passed. When they were finally repatriated to Japan, they found a nation in ruins, their villages leveled and their families struggling to rebuild. The welcome they received was not that of returning sons, but of ghosts. Neighbors whispered behind their hands. The word for prisoner of war, Horyo, was spoken like a curse. You lived, the whispers said, because you surrendered. You lived because you were a coward. The shared meal, the cigarettes, the unexpected harmonica tune, these memories of kindness felt like a secret shame. The mercy shown to them by the American Marines became a truth they could not speak of, a story denied by the very culture they had fought to defend. That night, as he tried to sleep on a mat in a crowded public shelter, Corporal Nakamura stared into the darkness and wondered, if the mercy was real, why did they have to pretend it never happened? Decades melted away, carrying with them the scars of war and the sharp edges of memory. Private Sato, now a grandfather with silver hair and hands gnarled by a lifetime of work in the fields, rarely spoke of Okinawa. It was a place locked away in the quietest corner of his mind, a landscape of ghosts and shame. His wife knew he had fought, and that he had been a prisoner, but the details were his own. His children knew even less. To them, he was simply a quiet, gentle man who worked hard and loved the land. But his grandson, Kenji, was a curious boy. He saw the flicker of pain in his grandfather's eyes during the August commemorations on television and felt the heavy silence that filled the house. One afternoon, as the old man sat on the porch mending a fishing net, Kenji found the courage to ask. He had discovered a strange object hidden in a wooden box at the back of a closet, a battered, dented aluminum mess tin, clearly of American military issue. It made no sense. His grandfather was a patriot who had fought the Americans. Why would he keep a relic of the enemy? He brought it to the old man, his small hands holding the piece of history as if it were a sacred artifact. "Grandfather," he asked, "why do you keep this?" Sato looked at the mess tin, and for the first time in over 50 years, he let the wall around his memory crumble. He told his grandson everything. He spoke of the dark cave, the gnawing hunger, and the paralyzing fear. He described the impossible sound of enemy laughter and the incomprehensible invitation to dinner. He remembered the taste of sweetened coffee and the shame that had brought him to tears. He admitted that sharing a meal with the enemy had not only saved his life, it had also saved his humanity by breaking the lies he had been forced to believe. Historians would later come to understand that these small, unofficial acts of mercy held a significance far greater than their immediate impact. The Geneva Convention provided a framework, but it was moments like these, a shared cigarette, a tin of beef, a song played on a harmonica, that gave the rules their meaning. In the Pacific, where the war was fought with a particular ferocity, these gestures defied the propaganda of both governments. The Japanese military had constructed a myth of the demonic American soldier, while American war posters often portrayed the Japanese as subhuman monsters. A simple shared meal cut through both narratives, proving that on the front lines, beneath the uniforms, were just young men caught in a conflict they did not create. The stories of Japanese prisoners of war remain exceptionally rare, silenced for generations by the cultural stigma of surrender. But those testimonies that have emerged, like Sato's, consistently reveal these cracks in the myth. They show that even in the most brutal of circumstances, the capacity for human decency can survive. In the 1,980 seconds, a new movement of reconciliation began to take shape. Veterans' reunions, once unthinkable, brought former enemies face to face on the quiet, manicured lawns of memorial sites. At one such event, an elderly American Marine, his back stooped with age, met a group of Japanese survivors. Through a translator, one of the Japanese men spoke of his capture, of his terror, and of the unexpected meal he was given. The American Marine nodded slowly, a sad smile touching his lips. He remembered that day, the heat, the exhaustion. He simply said, "We were just hungry boys, too." Sato finished his story, his voice raspy with emotion. He took the mess tin from his grandson's hands and turned it over and over, his thumb tracing the deep scratch marks on its surface. For half a century, this small object had been his secret burden and his private proof. It was a symbol of the shame his country had assigned him, but it was also a reminder of the moment a stranger had shown him compassion when he expected only cruelty. The memory had not been denied at home. It had simply been his to carry alone. Kenji looked from the mess tin to his grandfather's face, his young mind trying to grasp the immense weight of the story he had just heard. "But grandfather," he asked again, his voice filled with a new understanding, "why did you keep it all this time?" The old man looked out at the familiar hills of his homeland, the same hills he had dreamed of from a limestone cave on a distant island. He answered, "Because it wasn't just about dinner, Kenji. It was proof. Proof that the devils were human, and so was I. In war, cruelty is easy to remember. It is loud and leaves deep scars. But sometimes, the quiet honor of a meal shared in silence says more about what it means to be human than the loudest battle that came before."